Everyone ready? We're gonna go in 3, 2, 1.
My first character I created in ESO was a Dragonknight, so as much as I enjoy playing other classes, DK is always the one I go back to. The whole theme of it is just so satisfying to me. I mean, who doesn't like dragons and fire? They've definitely had their ups and downs over the years as to how they've performed compared to other classes, but for the last couple of patches they have been in a really great spot for PvE DPS. With the Ascending Tide DLC, I tested quite a few different setups, though this doesn't even come close to all of the great combos that could be put together. And you might notice I didn't do a lot with Bahsei's Mania. Don't get me wrong, it is an amazing option still. I just didn't really feel like messing around with the Magicka management that is required with it when working through a lot of these different configurations. So Reliquin was just a bit easier to slap on and not worry about when testing so many different setups out. As you can see, I did still get very good results with Bahsei when I did use it, and there will be a clip of it on the trial dummy towards the end of the video. It does seem like overall it is still the strongest set for Dragoknights and probably the one that I'll be using the most for the Ascending Tide DLC. I also wanted to give a shout out to some great videos out there from some other content creators as well covering Dragoknights this patch. I'll have them linked down in the description. I think it's always good to take multiple points of view when you're trying to get the most out of your builds, so make sure to check these guys out if you have a chance. And as with all of my guides, remember to treat this as a base to work from. Always tweak your setup to fit your situation and needs. With the recent hybridization of skills to scale with your highest stats, the doors are open to tons of different configuration options that can all get really great results. So hopefully this video will give you lots of ideas to work with and help you get the most out of your Dragonknight. The goal here is to not just straight up tell you what to do, though I will give some good setups for those who do want that, but instead to try and lay out the groundwork to help you decide these things for yourself. So even if your ideal setup isn't here, maybe this video inspires you to figure out something within your build to make it better. Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks, and this is my Dragonknight PvE DPS guide for the Elder Scrolls Online. So what will we cover in this video? I'll go through an overview of the hybridization changes, the top races, attribute points, our Mundus Stone, the consumables we can use. I'll go over light versus medium armor and the penetration cap and crit damage cap, and also some examples of what you'll need to reach those caps when testing on the trial dummy. We'll cover the champion points, several gear combinations, our skill bars, combat rotations, including some easier and some more advanced tips. I'll go through the test results for the different combinations I put together, and finally I'll show a few clips of some of the builds in action on the trial dummy. And for those that have already watched my Necromancer DPS guide, the overview section up through the light and medium armor section will be the same in this video. It really is packed full of some of the basic build aspects that work for every class. So if you've already seen that and you think you have a firm grip on it, feel free to go ahead and skip past that up to the champion points section. But if you haven't watched it yet, I definitely recommend you do so. And one last thing before we start, just wanted to say thank you so much to those who have subscribed to the channel. We just hit 40,000 subs. I will be giving away 50k crowns in ESO once we do hit that 50k mark. So if you aren't subbed and you want to help us get there a little quicker, that would be amazing. Subbing on YouTube is free, and you can always change your mind later if you're no longer interested in the content. With that all out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. So let's talk about the hybridization. The reason I'm combining both the stamina and the Magicka guides into one is because there are a lot of blurred lines now. With skills scaling off your highest resources, it isn't just stamina and weapon damage versus Magicka and spell damage, but you could even go stamina and spell damage or Magicka and weapon damage. Let me give some examples. I could stack fully into stamina, but run food with Magicka recovery, use light armor, use spell damage glyphs and spell power potions, and essentially play my character as what would have traditionally been the Magicka stacking kind of build. You do have to be a little careful doing something like this, as your main resource pool is then much smaller than your off resource pool, but your stats still scale with your highest, and if you mix in a couple of stam skills, generally it won't be too hard to sustain it. This also opens up the door to play into your racial bonuses a little better if you are doing a playstyle that might not be traditionally best suited for your race choice. Setups like this are going to allow you to really play lots of different playstyles on the fly without having to respec your character. So I could play what most would consider a traditional stamina build and a traditional Magicka build in the same piece of content just by swapping gear and skills around. As an example, I could have this setup that I just went through to go for a more Magicka heavy loadout, but then swap over to a different set with weapon damage glyphs on it, change my potions to weapon power potions, change my food, and bam, I'm pretty much fully spec'd back into a loadout that would support a lot of stamina abilities. Really, the main limitations now are your resource pools and how much you can sustain, so you will still need to make choices that allow for the build you want, but a lot more of that can be done now without respeccing your character. Of course, there will still be optimal ways to build. There will always be metas, always ways to min-max, but so many of these setups will allow for similar results, and there will be a lot more wiggle room for optimizing in a wider variety of ways for fights within an encounter. I will get into some of the finer details of all of this later in the video. For now, let's go ahead and move on to some of the basics of the build. The top race options haven't really changed. From a pure damage standpoint, if you're stacking into Magicka, the races with the best passives for damage are High Elf and Dark Elf, followed closely by Khajiit. If you are stacking into stamina, the top option is Dark Elf, followed closely by Orcs and Khajiits. But remember, this is just purely for min-maxing damage. There are lots of good reasons to go with other race options, and in the long run, the difference in the damage is not very big anyways. For example, I could go with an Imperial, and even though the damage might be a little lower than, say, a Dark Elf, I will have a bigger health pool and better sustain. This could also have a ripple effect on other aspects of my build choice as well, which can often shrink the gap of what it would look like the difference would be if you just look at the racial passives alone. And as I was discussing earlier, I could get a little more benefit out of my Imperial going that traditional spellcaster route now than in previous patches, since I could stack into stamina, which my racial passives support, but still build in a way that supports a lot of Magicka abilities. Just some food for thought. At the end of the day, play the race that you want. It really doesn't matter too much unless you are pushing for scores or going for world records. For our attribute points, you'll generally want to put all 64 points into either Magicka or Stamina. This is because your skills scale with your highest stats, and your lower of the two stats has no impact on the effectiveness of your skills, only for the sustain. If health is a big concern for you, you can shave off a few points to allocate there, but generally there are other ways you can accomplish this goal, so I wouldn't spend too many on health there. I haven't strayed from 64 points into one or the other in quite a while for a DPS character. And it might also be a good idea to stack into whatever bonus your racial passive gives as well. While it isn't necessary, it will increase your skill damage more to stack as much into one maximum resource as possible. For the Mundus Stone, in most situations the Thief is going to be the strongest option. I rarely swap off of this on any of my DPS characters. The Lover can be a nice option if you find yourself really lacking on penetration. Usually this would be for situations where you are running a medium armor build and your group doesn't have any additional support going to make up for the lost penetration from missing those light armor pieces. Or maybe you're running in some pickup groups without having any idea what kind of debuffs you might be getting from your teammates. But on the other hand, you really can't go wrong with the Thief. Crit chance is always good, and for the trial dummy, it will be the best option as well. Now let's go through the consumables. This section will be a bit more robust than usual. As briefly discussed earlier, the new hybridization of skills creates quite a few additional scenarios for the types of food and potions we might want to use together. So the two examples I gave earlier were each going to opposite ends of the spectrum, but you can mix and match in between them as well based on your skill choices and what kind of setup you need to sustain those skills. So let's start with the food options. If you do need any help figuring out how to craft some of these, UESP is a great resource for the different food options in the game. I always have their site linked in the descriptions of my videos. Let's start with our best options if we're stacking into Magicka. Feel free to skip ahead to the stamina section if that is the route you're going. Foods that add only max Magicka are technically the strongest option if you are confident going without any additional health on your food and you don't need any sustain help for your Magicka or your stamina abilities. Max Magicka plus health food is generally what I'd recommend if you find yourself in that situation though, as it's only 1k less Magicka, but you get a fat 5400 extra health to go along with it. But ultimately, it's up to you in deciding between those. If you are focusing mostly all into Magicka abilities and you're having trouble sustaining them, Ghastly Eyeball is still a great option there. Though, again, you won't have a health bonus, so you could be a bit squishy for some encounters. If you need a nice middle ground, Clockwork Citrus or Witch Mama's Potty Brew are also pretty good options. They don't give as much sustain as Ghastly, not as much health as Bystat Food, and not as much damage as either of those, but the difference is pretty small overall and the stats on these are a little more well-rounded. Clockwork is pretty expensive but offers slightly higher stats than Witch Mothers if gold is not a concern. Now we'll stick with stacking Magicka here, but these are some of the newer options we might use depending on how much stamina sustain we need. All of the options we just went through are fine if you are using some stamina abilities, as long as you aren't running your stamina pool dry with those options. But if you do find yourself needing some stamina sustain help, you can now run Bewitched Sugar Skulls or any traditional tri-stat food like the ones you get from your daily logins. These are nice because they still give you a decent bit of health, a pretty good amount of your main resource, and they also increase your off resource as well. This will be mostly if you just need a smidge more help with your stamina sustain, as it doesn't help with your recovery, but having a higher pool with more stamina to work with will also increase the amount of resources you get back from your synergies too. You could also go with a max Magicka plus max stamina food in this situation if you are confident for going the health bonus. And then if that's still not cutting it for your stamina sustain, you can also do the crunchy spider skewer recipe, which gives you max Magicka plus stamina recovery. You might need something like this if you end up with a very heavy stamina skill loadout, but still have Magicka as your main resource. Great option for that scenario, but again, no health on this food, so be careful where you use it. Now we'll go through the best options if you're stacking into stamina. Feel free to skip past this part if you are going the Magicka stacking route. The foods that add only max stamina are technically the strongest if you're confident going without any additional health on your food and you don't need any sustain help for your stamina or your Magicka abilities. Max stamina plus health food is generally what I'd recommend if you find yourself in that situation though, as it's only 1k less stamina, but you get a nice 5400 extra health to go along with it. It's up to you deciding between those. If you are still focusing mostly into stamina abilities and are having trouble sustaining them, Lava Foot is still a great option here, though again you won't have a health bonus on that. If you need a nice middle ground, Artam Takeaway Broth or Dubious are also both decent options. They don't give as much sustain as Lava Foot, not as much health as Bystat Food, and not as much damage as either, but the difference is pretty small overall and the stats on these are a little more well-rounded. Artam can be a little bit expensive but offers slightly higher stats than Dubious if spending extra gold is not a concern for you. Now we're going to stick with stacking stamina, but these are some of the newer options we might use depending on how much Magicka sustain we need. All of the options we just went through are fine, even if you are using some Magicka abilities, as long as you aren't running your Magicka pool dry with these options. But if you do find yourself needing some Magicka sustain help, you can now run Bewitched Sugar Skulls or any traditional tri-stat food like the ones you get from your daily logins. These are nice because they give you a decent amount of each of your resources. This will mostly be if you just need a smidge more help with your Magicka sustain, as it doesn't help with your recovery, but having a higher pool will give you more Magicka to work with and will increase the amount you get back from synergies too. You could also go the max Magicka plus max stamina food route in this situation if you're confident with no health bonus. And if that isn't cutting it for your mag sustain, you can also do the Candied Jester's Coins recipe, which gives you max stamina plus Magicka recovery. You might need something like this if you end up with a very Magicka heavy skill loadout but still have stamina as your main resource. A great option for that scenario, but again, no health on the food, so be mindful where you use it. Alright, that's going to do it for the food and drink options. I will make sure to list which kind I used when I show the results from each setup that was tested. Alright, moving on to potions and some of the other important things surrounding them. Major Brutality and Sorcery, the 20% weapon and spell damage boosts, are now combined together on skills that provide these buffs. The Dragonknight skill Igneous Weapons is really nice for this because it provides the buffs to the whole group and lasts for a really long time, so it is easy to keep up for whoever's in charge of it. I'll make sure to also cover the other options for these buffs later in the skills section. Major Savagery and Prophecy, which give a 12% boost to weapon or spell crit chance, are now combined on skills that give this buff, such as Inner Light or Camo Hunter. However, these buffs are not yet combined on potions, so with your typical spell power potions or weapon power potions, you will only get one or the other. This generally doesn't really matter too much since your skills scale with your highest stats anyways, but it does mean that if you want to use spell power potions, you need to make sure that you are stacking spell damage glyphs on your jewelry, and with weapon power potions, you'll need to use weapon damage glyphs. The reason that this is worth pointing out is because there might be certain builds or situations where you are stacking into one stat, let's say max Magicka, but you want to run potions that give you back stamina. Maybe you're stacking pretty heavily into stamina skills for a certain scenario. There aren't potions that give back stamina and also provide spell power buffs. And in the same way, there aren't potions that give the weapon power buffs and give you Magicka back. So essentially, if you find yourself wanting to go this route of using potions that restore your off resource, you either need to be getting your major buffs from skills, or you need to swap your jewelry glyphs to the matching off resource stat. There are potions that give both Magicka and stamina return, these just don't include the major crit and damage buffs. If you are getting those buffs from skills, these are great options to use though. You could use tripods in this situation, including the ones that you get for daily logins, which are identical to the crafted ones. Or another option, if you have the gold to spare, is to run the heroism potions. These can be really nice situationally to squeak out a little bit more damage by getting an extra ultimate off in an encounter. However, the ingredients are very expensive. Another interesting option I think, though probably a bit more niche, would be to do the Magicka return plus spell resistance or the stamina return plus physical resistance. This would depend on the content that you're running and what the prevalent damage type is in that encounter, and this is also of course provided that you already are getting your major damage and crit buffs from skills. These are unique resistance buffs, so they do stack with other major or minor resistance buffs you might not already be getting. Probably not a super common use, but still thought they were worth mentioning, and they aren't super expensive compared to a lot of other options. I think it's also worth noting as well that the minor versions of these buffs that come from class passives are not combined. This is Minor Brutality, which comes from Dragonknights, Minor Sorcery from Templars, Minor Savagery from Nightblades, and Minor Prophecy from Sorcerers. So depending on what you're stacking, you may need a certain class to help with that buff. Since everything scales with your highest stats now, this does create some interesting scenarios for these classes, especially solo, where you might end up wanting to stack into the opposite damage type of what you normally might on that spec. For example, as a solo Magicka Dragonknight, since you have access to Minor Brutality as a class passive, you might want to stack into weapon damage even if you are stacking max Magicka as your main resource. Same goes for a solo Stamina Templar. It might make more sense to stack spell damage instead of weapon damage, since you can boost that up further with your class passive. So this doesn't really matter too much if you have someone in your group providing these buffs already, but definitely an interesting change for certain solo setups or scenarios where you might be the only one of that class in the group. If you do go this route where you stack the opposite stat of your max resource, you need to make sure you're either getting your major damage buffs from skills or that your sustain is good enough to not need to use potions that complement your main resource. So I hope that makes it a bit easier to wrap your head around the current landscape of potions and the buffs that they give. It is a bit more complicated than in previous patches, but I think I covered most of the common situations here. And again, like with the food choices, I'll make sure to list which potions I used when giving specific test results. Alright, now let's go over light armor versus medium armor. ESO used to be pretty cut and dry, with light armor being for Magicka users and medium armor for stamina users. While there are still passives in those lines that tilt their usage towards those playstyles, these are more based around sustaining your resources and not damage oriented. All of the damage passives from light and medium armor are universal and will be of benefit to a DPS regardless of stacking into Magicka or stamina. So I'll quickly cover the main perks as a DPS for both types of armor. For each piece of light armor equipped, we get 4% increased Magicka recovery and 2% Magicka cost reduction, 1% crit chance, and 939 offensive penetration. For each piece of medium armor equipped, we get 4% increased stamina recovery and 2% stamina cost reduction, 2% critical damage, and 2% weapon and spell damage. So you can see with these bonuses, the only ones that are based on your main stat are the sustain passives. But sustain aside, there's no reason that a Magicka based build can't use medium armor or a stamina based build light armor. This gets more interesting with the Ascending Tide DLC because with skills scaling off your highest stats, you can build towards a more balanced array of skills in your loadout, often making sustain for your main stat a little less difficult since the cost types are more evenly split. So another key thing with light and medium, I think it's pretty interesting as well that they each have a stat with a cap on it. Penetration tops out at 18,200 for enemies that you face in PvE, and crit damage has a hard cap of 125%. So each of these skill lines has a stat that is only beneficial to stack up to a certain amount. Then they also each have a stat that is essentially always useful. There are certain niche situations like running mechanical acuity where your crit chance might become redundant, but for the vast majority of scenarios, you aren't ever hitting 100% crit chance, and therefore you don't have to really worry about having too much of it. And then with medium armor's weapon and spell damage, there's no cap on that, so you don't ever have to worry about having too much of that either. In optimized scenarios, that weapon and spell damage is usually a bit stronger than the crit chance line, so the choice really comes down to those other bonuses. If you need the penetration, light armor is really hard to pass up and will generally perform better than medium. But if you are good on penetration, medium is generally going to be a little stronger, even on Magicka builds, provided you can sustain it. And the same goes with light armor for stamina builds if you do need that penetration and you can sustain it. So to sum it up, if you are going mostly all into stamina skills or all into Magicka skills, you'll probably need to stick with your armor weight that corresponds to the sustain for it. But if you're mixing the two up a bit more, you can probably get away with some setups that you might not have been able to in the past. And kind of tying in with the light versus medium armor, for the last part of this section, I wanted to break down those penetration and crit damage caps. I do get a lot of questions over these, so I thought it would be useful to include a guide within this, but if you already have these concepts down pretty well, you can probably just skip past this section. But I thought I'd include some of the more common sources of penetration and crit damage for those that need help building up to those caps. So let's start with penetration. Enemies in dungeons and trials have 18,200 armor, so we need to ideally get to that point through bonuses and debuffs. It is worth noting that overland enemies only have 9,100 armor, so you don't need nearly as much there, and solo arena mobs do vary in resistances, but I'll have a link in the description if you're interested in digging further into that. But generally 18,200 is that mark that you want to hit for group content. So I won't go through every debuff here, but I did want to go through some of the common ones that you'll usually see. Major Breach reduces the enemy's armor by 5948. Minor Breach reduces it by 2974. If you have a tank using Pierce armor, these are both automatically applied to any enemy that is targeted with this attack. I won't list all of the skills and other sources that can provide these debuffs, but UESP has a great page for buffs and debuffs where you can quickly see every source of them in the game. Another popular armor debuff is the Crusher enchantment. This will generally go on an infused two-handed weapon and give another 2108 reduction to the enemy's armor. This is only one target per proc, so something to keep in mind for scenarios with many enemies. There is also a set called Torag's Pact that increases this value further, and it's actually present on the trial dummy, but you don't commonly see this set able to be squeezed into dungeon or trial compositions. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned it though, and I'll go through a list in just a bit of what to build for on a trial dummy after this initial breakdown. These next debuffs will come from sets that you may or may not have in your group, so you'll definitely want to coordinate that if you are working on some of the harder challenges in the game. Alkosh gives up to a 6k armor debuff, and Crimson Oath gives a 3541 armor debuff. Since the Crusher debuff is single target only, these sets can be really nice to have for AoE packs, even if you are normally already built to hit the penetration cap for bosses. Dragon's Defilement is another nice set for these AoE kind of situations. It gives the Minor Breach debuff that we already mentioned, but it is in an AoE, so like I said, Pierce armor only applies it to a single target, so tank would have to puncture a bunch of targets in a row to get it on all of them, while this set will just apply it to many things at once. So those top three debuffs there are ones you can generally count on having in even a semi-organized group. It doesn't take much at all to keep them up, and if you subtract them from the 18,200 total, that leaves you with 7170 penetration to bring to the table. So we can get 700 pretty early on through our champion points, and then there are some class-specific passes for these as well, like Necros get the 1500 with their Gravelord ability active. Nightblades also get 2974 when flanking. Aside from those, Maces and Mauls give 1650 and 3300. The Sharpened trait gives 1638 or 3276 depending on if it's a one-handed or two-handed weapon. Light armor gives 939 for each piece equipped. Certain sets have bonuses that are usually 1487 penetration, and Wood Elves have a unique racial passive of 950 penetration. So you can see, because we need 7170 penetration, most classes aren't left with a ton of options that don't sacrifice a good bit of stats that we could get elsewhere, like losing crit chance from dropping daggers for maces, or losing some of our weapon trait power from swapping to sharpened. This is a key part of why light armor is so popular right now in most PvE groups. It just makes it really easy to build to that penetration cap. 7 pieces of light armor alone with our champion point passive already gets us more than enough penetration to 18,200 when combined with those top 3 debuffs. This is medium armor's biggest weakness, as the stats are technically a little better than light pieces, but there just aren't too many easy ways to get to that pen cap without sacrificing other areas. Some groups will opt to run Alkosh on a damage dealer to offset that penetration, and that can be a good option if you're getting good uptimes on it. However, counting on a 6k armor debuff when you're setting up your own personal stats, if that debuff is falling off a lot, it's going to be a really noticeable DPS loss. So you need to make sure the Alkosh wearer is on their A game keeping it up. Before we move on to crit damage, let's quickly go over what is on the trial dummy and what you need to bring there. So it does have Major and Minor Breach, and as I mentioned earlier, the Torag's Pact infused Crusher enchantment is on there. This also has the Alkosh debuff applied. However, it is an old version of Alkosh before they buffed it up to the 6k armor shred, so this only takes off 3010 armor instead. So if we subtract those off of there, we end up with 3212 penetration that we need to bring. This is why you often see that you can work in more medium armor on the trial dummy stuff, because there is less ground to make up than your typical dungeon or trial scenario. And especially on Nightblades and Necros, since they have pin in their class kits. So building for a trial dummy is more comparable to having some additional help with pin in a dungeon or trial. And like I said, these aren't all the sources for penetration bonuses and debuffs, but these are some of the main ones that you'll generally see. So I hope that helps for those that may have been a little confused on how much penetration they should be bringing. Now let's go through the crit damage cap. This includes both buffs and debuffs on the targets. You can't exceed 125% additional damage when critically striking an enemy. Everyone has a base of 50% crit damage to start with, so even if you don't build a single stat towards crit damage, if you land a crit, you will deal 1.5 times damage compared to a normal hit. For group buffs and debuffs, we have Major Force, Major Brittle, Minor Brittle, and Elemental Catalyst. For buffs that we bring ourselves, we have Fighting Finesse and Backstabber from our champion points, Minor Force, a class passive for Templars, Nightblades, and Wardens, Khajiit's racial passive, and then 2% for each piece of medium armor that we're wearing. A couple of common gear sets we see in PvE that also give crit damage are the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt and Sulksan's Torment. So let's go over the trial dummy. It does have 100% uptime on Major Force and Minor Brittle, so keep those two in mind when you are building towards that 125% cap. After your base of 50% plus those two, you'll need to find a way to bring 45% crit damage to hit that cap. Again, this isn't a comprehensive list, but these are the most common sources. Alright, now we'll go through the champion points. For most cases, we'll be running Backstabber, Master at Arms, Deadly Aim, and Thaumaturge. If you find yourself below the crit damage cap, it could be good to squeeze in Fighting Finesse in place of Thaumaturge. Depending on your specific skill loadout though, Thaumaturge could still be better than Fighting Finesse even if you are lower than the crit damage cap. Also in a trial, you might have additional crit damage debuffs like Elemental Catalyst, so you might not have to worry about Fighting Finesse anyways. For AoE heavy encounters such as trash pools, if you have enough champion points to be flexible with multiple nodes, it is nice to slot Biting Aura in place of Deadly Aim. Alright, now let's go through the gear. This of course won't cover every possible good setup, though it will have quite a few. I do have a list of all my favorite sets on my website at skinnycheeks.gg under the Helpful Resources tab if you want to check that out. And I also recently did a video covering the top 10 easy to get sets in the game, which you can grab right out of the gate with no farming. If you want to read up more on these sets and where they come from, ESOU and the ESO sets websites are both always linked in my descriptions and are great resources for that. I also won't be going through gear combinations for AoE trash setups in this video, but I will be getting those added to my website, so make sure to check back there. This first combo will be using two 5-piece sets, a 1-piece monster set with a mythic item, and an arena set backbarred. Usually the best 1-piece monster set to use is Slimecraw, as it offers slightly more crit chance than your standard crit bonus. However, a 1-piece with penetration on it, such as Krog or Valken, can also be really good here if you need the pin. For the body set, Bahsei's Mania and Reliquin are going to be our strongest options. Bahsei did get a slight nerf down to 12% instead of 15%, but is still pretty much the strongest light armor set you can go with. If you are able to go with medium armor, Reliquin is also a really strong option that doesn't require that micromanagement of your resources that Bahsei does, but the downside is that it's only pure single target damage for the proc. So really strong if your focus is just one target, but outside of that, probably best to go a different route. But I will go through a few alternatives here in a moment, including some options for those that don't do trials. For our mythic item, we'll be doing the Harpooner's Waiting Kilt. This is really nice in a lot of trial encounters where you can keep the stacks up from not taking damage. Not a big fan of it in 4-man content, and definitely not for solo content, but it is the strongest offensive mythic when you can maintain the stacks. I'll go through some other mythic options in just a bit as well. For our front bar set, we'll go with daggers or an Inferno Staff. My favorite options for the sets are Kinra's Wrath. This gives us Major Berserk, a 10% damage boost. Berserking Warrior, which stacks up a ton of crit chance. Pillar of Nirn, which has a really strong damage proc, both an upfront hit and a damage over time effect. Zogvin's Warband, which stacks up both crit chance and gives us minor force for some crit damage. And Zin's Redress, which is a group support option that is especially popular on Dragonknight due to how many dots that will work for it that we usually already run in our loadouts. You can also sub in a mace or maces for the daggers if you find yourself below the pin cap. You'll see I did this with some of my setups using Reliquin later. Losing the crit chance from the dagger hurts, but it's roughly the same ballpark as dropping the Slimecraw piece and doing the 1-piece penetration instead. And then for the back bar, we're going with the Maelstrom Greatsword or the Maelstrom Inferno Staff. There are other arena set options you could use here, but these two are just my favorite right now. We'll be going all divines on the body pieces, bloodthirsty on the jewelry, precise if you're using a staff on the front bar, or Nern plus charged if you're using daggers. Dragonknight is also very nice with double charged on the daggers due to their unique combustion passive. It seems to be just slightly less damage than Nern plus charged, but your sustain will be noticeably better. And then as usual, infused for our back bar weapon. The body glyphs will be either all Magicka or all stamina, depending which stat you're stacking. The jewelry will be all weapon or spell damage glyphs, depending on how you are set up there as well. The weapon damage glyphs are probably preferable if you're running solo or without a Templar in the group, as you will be able to provide your own minor brutality for a 10% buff to your weapon damage, and this won't apply to spell damage. So just something to keep in mind if you do end up going this route. You will need to be either okay using weapon power potions or getting your major buffs through a skill like igneous weapons. If you want to use spell power potions, you're going to need spell damage glyphs if you're not getting that buff somewhere else. Then we'll use a flame glyph if using a staff on the front bar, or a flame plus a poison glyph if using daggers, and a weapon damage glyph on the back bar. For some other mythic alternatives to the kilt, for solo you can use the Pale Order ring instead for some nice healing that is based on your damage dealt. Just keep in mind this does have decreased effectiveness the more group members you add. For a bit safer setup for group play, the Death Dealer's Fate Ring is a nice option to replace the kilt. This adds a little damage still since you get max resources, but it also boosts up your health a bit. This one tops out at 2640 of each resource. Then another alternate option is to use the Thracian Stranglers. These require killing blows, so generally are too hard to guarantee stacks for in trial content when you are sharing killing blows with a lot of other players. However, in solo or 4-man content, you can often get these stacked up pretty quickly, and they offer a pretty hefty damage boost at 1150 extra weapon and spell damage at max stacks. You do take a penalty to your health and damage shield size for each stack gained as well, so it is a little riskier, just something to keep in mind. And these stacks do reset on changing zones, so you can't just pre-stack it up before you port somewhere. For some alternate set options that work with this type of a loadout, Alkosh, Martial Knowledge, Master Architect, and War Machine are probably the most popular support options that are sometimes worn on a DPS character. This is in addition to Zen, of course, which we already talked about earlier. Zen is definitely the most popular one to run on a Dragonknight. Some other really good sets here situationally are Zuxan's Torment if you can keep up the bonus, which requires dying enemies to activate. Azurblight Reaper and Plague Break are great for AoE encounters. Azurblight even if you just have a few enemies, but Plague Break really shines when there's a ton of enemies all packed into one space. False Gods or Vicious Ophidian if you need some sustain help. These can be especially nice if you're stacking into the opposite stat of what your build is using. So let's say I'm going all into stamina, but I want to go with a full mage type of setup. It could be really nice to run False Gods on that build. So even though the main resource pool that you are using will be small, this can help to make it possible to still sustain a ton of skills that cost that resource. Obviously, it would be better usually to stack into the main resource that you're using, but maybe your race choice has a benefit of the opposite stat, so just another cool option that comes with this patch. Mantle of Sororia is still a pretty decent option if you're stacking into Magicka and it's a more stationary fight. Twice Fanged Serpent is not as commonly seen, but if you are missing a lot of penetration and you don't want to change Mundus Stones often, this is a ton of extra penetration on the 5-piece bonus. Some other great options, Mother's Sorrow, Leviathan, and Medusa are all easy to get options that provide a nice amount of crit chance. Silks of the Sun is pretty solid for an overland set as well if you're going fully into flame abilities, but not so great if you start mixing in more than a couple of non-flame skills. Elfbane is also a pretty fun choice if you are going this route, although it is a heavy set and so it does have limitations there with how we can set it up. And then finally, Heartland Conqueror is a pretty fun crafted set that works pretty well on Dragonknights. Not as good as some of the meta options for PvE DPS, but can definitely still get good results and maybe a good starter set for you until you can put something else together. All right, this next setup we'll look at here is very similar, except instead of a 1-piece monster set plus a mythic, we'll just be using a 2-piece monster set. There are a ton of good monster set options. I did most of my testing on this patch with Kjolnar and Selene, but there are so many other good options on top of what's listed here. Domahouse, Grothdar, Balorg, Valkynscoria, the list goes on. Tons of fun options to run depending on what you're trying to work on. People often ask, what is the best monster set for X class? And while some do tend to be better on some classes than others, it really is usually more about what you are using it for. And then everything else about this setup is the same as combo number 1. All right, this third configuration here is one of my favorites. This particular type of loadout is sometimes called the 5-2-2-2-2-1 setup. It's basically one 5-piece set, a 2-piece set, usually one that gives crit or pin, a 2-piece monster set, 2 arena sets, and a mythic item. So same monster sets as before, and Harpooner's still the strongest offensive mythic option. And then we can run any 2-piece in the game that has crit chance on it, or you can run one with penetration if you find yourself under the cap. You could also do a 2-piece trainee here if you wanted, if you're stacking into Magicka in your build. It does give you some health. The Magicka bonus isn't as much as getting some crit chance or pin, but you know, maybe that extra health is more worth it to you. Then for our 5-piece set, Bahsei and Reliquant are probably still the best here, but I combine those other previous front bar sets here as well, since we only have room for one 5-piece set with this loadout, and maybe you'd rather use one of those. I didn't include Berserking Warrior here, as we do need a couple of body pieces minimum, and it is a heavy set. Then for our weapons, Black Rose Prison Dual Wield or Vateshran Dual Wield on the front bar, and then the Maelstrom 2-hander or Inferno on the back bar. You can go with other arena options again, but these are just my favorites right now. I did try out the VMA Dual Wield on the front bar, and it performed okay. The rotation was a lot more hectic for worse results than just doing one of the other setups, so I don't know, to me that's just not worth it. One thing I really like about this is because we have a full monster set and we can use any set for the 2-piece bonus, we can really customize our light versus medium pieces to the exact amount that we want. For example, if I want to run Reliquant but still need a fair amount of pin from light armor, I could go with a light monster set and then a light set for that 2-piece bonus, or even do a light set that has a 2-piece bonus with penetration like Roaring Opportunist, and then right there I have 4 light pieces and a pin bonus, which can really help make up a lot of missing pin if you need it. Or you can go the opposite route if you don't need the pin and stack more medium pieces in while still wearing something like Bahsei. It's very versatile and you can really tweak it to get it just where you need it for your particular group or playstyle. And another benefit you have if you are using the Black Rose Prison Dual Wield set, you're not only getting major evasion from casting Deadly Cloak, but the Spectral Cloak set is also giving you another 6% damage mitigation as well. So this is a great setup if you want to add in a bit of extra tankiness on your DPS. And all the previous sets mentioned could work here as well. One final thing I wanted to note is that if you wanted, you could replace the monster set, the mythic, and the 2-piece with just another 5-piece set. I find this is generally not as strong, but something to possibly consider if you want to go that route. And then the last combo we'll cover is a little more niche, but definitely still capable of very good results. It's very similar to the first option, except instead of doing a back bar arena set, we'll be doing a front bar arena set and then back barring our 5-piece set. So we use something ideally like Pillar of Nirn or Zen, since both of those have easy to keep up procs that don't require maintaining stacks. And that enables us to front bar that arena set. This is another nice option if you want to run those juicy Black Rose daggers for some extra mitigation. But yeah, everything else about the build will remain the same as the previous setups. Alright, let's go through the skills. I won't be going through all of the passives, but I'll have the essential ones up on the website if you are a little short on skill points and you only want to take the absolutely necessary ones. The first setup we'll go through here is more for boss loadouts, but luckily with all the AoE that DKs have in their kits, if you don't like swapping stuff around for different encounters, there are ways you can easily set up that work well for both single target and AoE damage. We'll start with our front bar. I'll come back to that first flex spot here in a second, but the core abilities that we'll usually slot here are Engulfing Flames. This has a nice upfront hit and an okay damage over time, but the best part is that it has a 10% flame damage taken debuff that it puts on the enemy, and it also triggers our Seething Fury passive from our whip being slotted, which temporarily gives us more weapon and spell damage, as well as boosting our next cast of Molten Whip. Next is Venomous Claw. This is a really strong single target damage over time effect, and also triggers our Seething Fury passive. And then our main spammable we'll want to use is Molten Whip. This one just hits so hard due to that passive that it has, and makes other abilities hit harder as well, since it increases our weapon and spell damage. The other morph can be okay if you need the incoming heals, and it's also better on sustain, but generally the Molten Whip morph is going to be the stronger DPS option. Next we have Flames of Oblivion. It's a really strong direct damage ability, but it does act more like a dot because we only cast it every 15 seconds and it fires out 4 rounds of fireballs in that time. But they are technically counted as direct damage for stat purposes. This is a great skill even for single target DPS, but is really insane for AoE DPS, as each time that it fires off it shoots out 3 fireballs at a time. Then for our ultimate we have Flawless Dawnbreaker slotted here simply for the Fighters Guild passes, but can also be nice to cast in a pinch if we don't have time to build up for our main ultimate. On the back bar, we have Barbed Trap. This can also go on the front bar depending on how our other skills are configured, so we won't double bar it, you'll just swap this out for something else if you do have it on the front bar. Nice single target dot, but the main reason we use it is the 10% crit damage boost we get from it with Minor Force. Then we have our weapon line back bar dot, which will vary depending on what weapon type we have slotted. My favorite two right now here are Stampede and Unstable Wall. And then we have another flex spot. Mystic Orb is a very strong AoE dot, but is pretty expensive to cast every 10 seconds. Degen is a bit cheaper and can be run in its place, but it's only single target and a bit lower in DPS. I'll go through some other good options here in a bit. Our next skill will be Eruption. This is pretty much a staple of our back bar skills here as a DK. It has a nice upfront hit from it, a really nice dot, and a long timer on it as well. Just make sure to try not to recast it faster than 10 seconds if you need to reposition it, as the upfront hit does have a 10-second cooldown on it to prevent it from essentially being a free AoE spammable. And then our last regular skill spot here is Scalding Rune. This is a very nice upfront hit with an okay dot that it leaves behind. This, like the orb slotted, are very flexible for other skills we might want to run depending on our weapon types we're using and what resource types we can sustain. And then finally, our ultimate will usually be Standard of Might here. It's one of the best ults in the game. Really long, 20 seconds, and not only deals nice flame damage in an AoE, but boosts our damage and reduces our damage taken as well. Really crazy good skill here. For encounters that are very short, Fiery Rage can also be a nice option as it is more upfront burst damage, but does require you to have a Flame Staff slotted. Alright, let's cover some notes. Back to that front bar flex spot we skipped over earlier. Burning Talons is super strong, but is only on a 4-second timer, so it's extremely hard on your Magicka sustain. The AoE damage from it is really good though if you can manage keeping it up. Some other options here are Inner Light or Camo Hunter if you just want some passive stats and less skills to keep up. Inner Light should be the better version if you are stacking into Magicka and you already have Minor Berserk provided. If you don't have Minor Berserk, Camo Hunter should be the better option, and also if you're stacking into Stamina, then you don't really have much use for Inner Light either. Deadly Cloak is another great skill to slot here if you're doing dual wield. This is a great dot and also gives you Major Evasion, which reduces your damage taken from AoE abilities by 20%. So really nice for survivability too. Next up, Carve is a really nice AoE dot if we're running a two-handed back bar. It is pretty unique in how it functions in that the timer on it increases from 12 seconds to 22 seconds to 30 seconds if we recast it early before the timer expires. And then as long as we keep recasting it at 28 or 29 seconds and not letting it run out, it will keep refreshing at that 30-second length. On paper, you might think it doesn't look like the strongest dot, but for encounters that last a couple of minutes or longer, the extra time that the long dot gives you for other abilities is super beneficial and makes it a really strong option. For a lot of the setups I tested with, I used heroism potions to get back my ultimate a little quicker. If you do go this route, or you're running tripods or other potions that don't have your major buffs on them, you'll need to make sure that you have Inner Light or Camo Hunter on the back bar for the major crit chance buffs, and then use Degeneration or Igneous Weapons for the major weapon and spell damage buffs. Then we're free to use whichever potions we want. If you are running Medusa or Zogvin, or you're already at the crit damage cap, maybe you are a Khajiit, you can drop Barb Trap for another skill that you might want, like a stronger AoE dot, though Barb Trap is a fairly good dot for single target damage, so it is a nice route to go for that 10% crit damage if you need to get it from somewhere. Burning Embers is the alternate morph to Venomous Claw. It doesn't deal as much damage since it doesn't ramp up like Claw does, but it has a heal over time associated with it, which can be nice for solo play or running with no healer if you aren't using something like the Ring of the Pale Order. Scalding Rune is pretty good, but one of our first dots to go if we do need to make room for something else in our kit. So this is where we would put a shield like Dampen Magic or Bone Shield, or a heal like Coagulating Blood for a burst heal, or Vigor for a nice heal over time. And you'll see on a lot of the tests I did also use Caltrops. This is a nice long 15-second AoE dot. It isn't anything crazy for damage, but it's fairly strong, and since it costs stamina, depending on how you are loading out, it can help you take some pressure off of your Magicka usage by having an extra stamina costing dot. The Razor Caltrops morph can also be really good here if you need the Major Breach, but really probably not needed in most group content, as there are plenty of other ways to get this debuff, but could especially be nice solo. Stone Giant is another spammable ability that the Dragonknights have in their kit. This one provides a unique debuff called Stagger, which causes enemies to take more damage from every tick of damage dealt to them. It is a really nice group buff. At high levels of play, it is ideally kept up by tanks, but it can be pretty demanding to do so in a lot of content, so having a DPS do it is another good option. It does cost stamina though, so if you are building into Magicka, this could be tough to sustain without really compensating for it in the way that you set your character up. But you could also use it alongside of Molten Whip, though this makes for a more challenging rotation. Clive did a really nice job of this in the video he posted on YouTube. It was one of the ones I mentioned at the beginning of the video that I have linked down in the description. And then Shrouded Daggers can also be used as your main spammable if you are using the Vateshran dual wield set. This set is pretty nuts and gives any class a really strong execute. Again, this is a stamina costing ability like Stone Giant, so it could be harder to sustain, but you can also use this alongside of Whip, which can make it a little bit easier to manage, so slotting it in that flex spot where Talons or Deadly Cloak is listed. That's the route that Lord Reaper went when setting up with his Vateshran dual wield setup. Another bit more niche option, which is actually what got me my highest parse, was to drop Engulfing Flames and slot Shrouded Daggers in that spot. You definitely won't want to do this if you are the only DK in the group, as that debuff is too nice to give up. But if someone else is already providing it, I found it to work really well with that setup to drop it off. This allows us to keep Barbed Trap on the front bar for the passive 3% weapon and spell damage from the Fighters Guild passives. But really there are a lot of ways you can go about it. One warning though, with using the Vateshran dual wield set, the flanking radius on it does seem to be a good bit smaller than your traditional backstabber radius, so you'll need to make sure that you can stay directly behind the target to get the full effect from it. And then finally, if it helps to see it this way, this is usually the core of our loadout. This is kind of what I was playing around mostly, and then you can kind of mix and match different abilities in those open slots. A lot of different options can go there depending on what we're trying to accomplish. All right, let's move on to our AoE skill loadout. This will be mostly for if you want to swap to different setups for different scenarios. If you do want a one-size-fits-all skill setup, I'd recommend configuring the boss setup in a way that has strong AoE damage, such as burning Talons on your front bar, for example. For the front bar here, we're going to be going with Inner Light or Camo Hunter. Again, same principles as we talked about earlier. Magicka stacking and don't need the Minor Berserk, go Inner Light. Or if you're Magicka stacking and you do need Minor Berserk, or if you're Stamina stacking, we'll go with Camo Hunter. Then we have Engulfing Flames again. This is kind of a flex skill really if you have others in the group already running it, but a must-have if you are supplying the debuff from it. Then we have Burning Talons, which we can use as a nice AoE dot or spammable. And then we have a spot where we can designate specifically for a spammable if we aren't using our other front bar skills in that role. Whirling Blades, Flame Pulsar, Carve, and Shrouded Daggers all seem really good here. Whirling is dual wield and Pulsar is if you have a staff, and both of those seem more suited towards handling really any kind of AoE situation you might run into. Running Carve or Brawler is mostly just going to be if you're doing the Master's two-hander, and that's really nice for scenarios where you have a lot of enemies grouped up. And then again, Shrouded Daggers is nice if you're using the Vateshran dual wield. This is more for scenarios where the AoE pool might have 3 or fewer elite targets, since the daggers only bounce a few times, but for those smaller packs, this does seem to work pretty well. Again, you'll have to be able to flank from directly behind to make use of that Vateshran dual wield bonus. And then finally, for our regular skills, we have Deep Breath. This is a really strong semi-spammable that works kind of like Blast Bones or Shulks if you played Necro or Warden. It is very expensive though, and does require you to hit a target with the initial cast for that strong secondary portion to go off, so you can't pre-cast it as you're running in like you could with Shulks on a Warden or Blast Bones on a Necro. And then Dawnbreaker, again like the last setup, just for the passives. And then for our back bar, we have Channeled Acceleration for our minor force buff, Unstable Wall, Stampede, or Arrow Barrage, depending on the back bar type that we're running here. Though Staff is especially nice when you have an ult up due to Staff back bar giving us access to the Fiery Rage ultimate. If you happen to not be doing a two-handed back bar and you have the two-hander on the front bar instead, you could also slot Stampede on the front bar. That's a pretty nice option too. Next up is Mystic Orb for a nice AoE dot, Eruption for another nice AoE dot that has a good upfront hit, Flames of Oblivion for a nice ability that we can precast. It only hits 3 targets at a time, but it hits really hard and has a long timer, so this is an easy one to cast as you're running in before you initiate the encounter. And then for our ultimate, same as the boss setup, except I think Destro ult is a little more commonly useful, as usually trash encounters don't quite last long enough for the standard of might, but if you do find yourself on a specific AoE trash encounter that lasts 20 seconds or longer, Standard of Might should be stronger there. For some notes, if you are able to precast Channel Acceleration and then hot swap it off of your bar, you could slot Whip there for your Seething Fury passive. You could just spam Flames of Oblivion a few times before you run in to build up those stacks. Or you could just slot another skill there you might need, like Proximity Detonation. This also applies if you already are at the crit cap or already have Minor Force from another source. Deep Breath is a strong semi-spammable, but you might be better off with a passive boost like Camo Hunter or another Fighter's Guild ability, or you could even slot Deadly Cloak if you're running dual wield on the front bar to get a nice dot and some extra mitigation. You don't necessarily need a spammable either, as Deep Breath and Talons are both good spammables too. It can be nice to slot some of the ones listed as they have some extra special properties that make them strong, but definitely isn't necessary. Engulfing is also one that you can drop if you have other DKs in the group running it. It isn't bad or anything, but another passive boost or Deadly Cloak or something there might prove better if the group already has the Engulfing debuff covered. All right, let's move on to the rotations. So I'm going to do this section a little different from my other videos. I did a lot of different skill setups in my testing, and there are little differences in the rotations, even though they mostly follow the same principles. So we'll start here with a bunch of different openings for the different skill setups, and then we'll go through some static rotation options, followed by some tips for doing dynamic rotations. All right, this first set of openings here will be for using a staff on the back bar. I'm not going to go through each rotation line by line because there are going to be several in this video, but they will be up on the website as well if you want to look back at them. But I will go ahead and cover some notes about them. So to clarify, these are just the openings. This will be how you initiate combat, and then later we'll get into the repeated parts of the rotations. If you are able to pre-buff Channeled Acceleration and swap it off your bar, it's a nice option to get a little more opening burst without having to lay down Barb Trap immediately. You don't necessarily need add-ons to do this. If you have your skill menu ready with the skill you want to swap on, you can pre-buff Channeled Acceleration. It's 36 seconds, so it lasts a while, and then you can swap on the skill that you want to put in its place. But if you don't want to mess with that, move Barbed Trap up to the spot right before you start your light attack weaving. And then the same principle will go if you want to pre-buff the Igneous Weapons skill for your Major Brutality and Sorcery if you're not using potions that give these buffs, like heroism potions or tri-potions, for example. Some of the most common ways to dump Magicka before the fight for using Bahsei's Mania are Siege Shield or Purge, as these have really high costs. If you can't swap skills on and off your bar, you can also use Inner Light if you're running that, and if not, whatever your highest costing mag skill is. Mystic Orb, Deadly Cloak, or other skills that can be activated from a distance without initiating combat are good to cast before you run in to get a head start on some skills and a little bit higher opening burst. Just make sure when you're doing this that you're far enough back that you don't start combat right away. Standard of Might is generally best held until after you've placed your dots down for the opening. I like to wait until I have everything cast up till Eruption and then cast my ult, and then Eruption has a nice upfront hit that is not bad to have boosted by your standard. If you have the fight timed out really well and know that you will have time for a standard at the end of the fight and are squeezing to get that full duration off, you could also cast your first standard immediately when you get into combat to start building up ult a little quicker and guarantee that you'll get your ticks from your final standard as well. This is a small nuanced kind of thing. I noticed on some of my parses without heroism potions that my third standard was only getting about half of the duration off, so on some of those I changed to cast my standard right away into combat instead of waiting for all my dots. If you are running Burning Talons, cast it right after your first Venomous Claw cast and then mix in with your whips and try and keep up as close to every 4 seconds as possible. If there are skills listed here that you aren't running, feel free to skip those spots in the openings and sub in the skills that you are running, so long as they are a similar length to the skill that you're swapping out. So for example, if you're running Stone Giant instead of Whip or another spammable, you can just slot those in for the whip spots on the chart. So the first 2 openings listed here are for using Unstable Wall, and the third is for Blockade of Fire. And like I said, I'll get into the rotations for those in a bit. These are just how we initiate the combat in the beginning. And make sure if you do drop a skill off, let's say you aren't running Deadly Cloak like those second 2 rotations have, but you also aren't replacing it with any other dot, make sure you add on an additional whip cast for every skill that you drop so that the total rotation length is still the same. And then finally, none of these are exclusive to doing dynamic or static rotations. You can do the same opening no matter which route you end up going after that. So for the 2-handed openings, the notes are the same here, so I won't read through each of these again, but our openings will be slightly altered to account for Carve and Stampede, but the basic principles are the same either way. And you can easily convert the openings for doing bow or dual wield back bars as well if you're going that route. To comment on these a bit, on that first opening, if you aren't pre-buffing igneous weapons, make sure to cast Degeneration earlier to get your Major Brutality and Sorcery rolling. Same with the third opening there and Shrouded Daggers, since that is the skill that we are relying on for our Sorcery and Brutality there. And again, just like the staff versions, these can all open up for either dynamic or static rotations. These are just the starting points. If you don't like messing with the more nuanced intros, that's fine. It's not a huge deal. You can just precast your Flames of Oblivion, drop your ultimate, and then move right into the static rotations that we'll get into now. It won't be as much opening burst, but it is less to keep up with if you're just getting your feet wet. So for the staff rotations, 15-second static is kind of awkward with Unstable Wall because it's a 10-second dot, but it does line up really well with the other morph, Blockade of Fire, which lasts 14 seconds. In that first rotation, I did keep up Deadly Cloak dynamically, but if you weren't running that, then you wouldn't have any abilities that don't line up with that 15-second rotation. I do prefer Unstable Wall over Blockade as it is a fair bit more damage, so you can alter the rotation a bit to include Unstable Wall. You'll just use your other dots in the static portions of the rotation and then keep up Wall dynamically as it runs out. There isn't really a good way to fit in this morph of Wall in a static because it's only 10 seconds. And again, if we weren't running Deadly Cloak like in that third scenario there, then your only dynamic ability would be Wall at that point. With all of these rotations, if you do miss reapplying something, you don't have to wait until you're all the way back through the static rotation to get back to your whips to reapply it. You can just squeeze a cast in between skills. It does delay things a little, but it's not a huge deal overall. Kind of the price you pay to keep things static. If you can wait until after Engulfing and Claw, the Trap and Eruption are generally recast early anyways, and so it doesn't really hurt to delay those a little if you want to squeeze in an ability before those. And so these aren't perfect, they are static, and so some abilities are under or overcast to keep them in that static 15-second window, but I will go through some dynamic tips a little later. But for now, let's go through some notes about this. Mystic Orb is great to work in dynamically if it is sustainable. On the dummy, it's pretty tough to get through without running out of Magicka with Orb though, and same with Talons. It's really great, but even more mag drain than Orb is. And then feel free to swap in and out abilities that you may be running so long as their timers are similar, or same thing if you're running a different spammable. I will get into some Stone Giant rotations here in a bit. And then one final note about Zen's Redress. If you are in charge of keeping that up, make sure that the rotation you're doing has at a minimum 4 dots that count for it, and then Poisoned and Burning should be enough to take care of the rest. This is especially easy to hit if you're running Reliquin and a VMA two-hander, as both of those dots count too, but even without those, it still isn't hard to get to that 4 dot spot. All of these setups have at least the minimum for Zens. For the two-handed rotations, they are pretty much the same as using Blockade of Fire. Stampede being 15 seconds now works perfectly with a 15-second rotation. The only difference really is that we will be keeping up Carve dynamically, and in some cases also Deadly Cloak dynamically if we are running that. It might seem a little daunting if you're not used to dynamic abilities. Don't worry about getting perfect uptimes, just keep an eye on them while you're spamming your whips and reapply if they need it. The rest of your dots will be lining up perfectly each time, so you really only have to keep your eye on one or two things. You do want to make sure you don't let Carve fall off. I did mess up in several of my rotations that I recorded and spaced out and forgot about it. As we talked about earlier, the timer will reset back to 12 seconds instead of 30 seconds if you do. It's not the end of the world, but you will have to stack it back up again. The best spots to keep an eye on it to reapply are in place of your whip casts or before your trap or eruption casts, since those are generally recast early anyways and can be delayed with no loss there. If you do find you are in a different section of the rotation and it is about to run out, it's not a huge deal to stop and refresh it and just delay everything by 1 second. Better that than to let the timer reset back to 12 seconds for Carve. So the first two there are pretty straightforward. The third is for Vateshran dual wield though, so it is also essentially the same rotation, but as I mentioned earlier in one of my parses with it, I ran without Engulfing Flames. If you are running Engulfing, you will cast it in front of Claw as usual, like in the two rotations to the left. We are keeping up Carve dynamically with this one too, which we already talked about, but really once you get used to it, it's pretty easy with that really long timer on it. Like I said, I did zone out on a few of these parses though and totally forget about it. And we are using Shrouded Daggers here for our Major Brutality and Sorcery with this build, so even though we're opening with mostly whip casts, you want to make sure you still at least cast Shrouded Daggers every 20 seconds to keep the major buffs rolling. You probably will need to cast it anyway, as whipping is pretty Magicka intensive in a stam stacking setup, but having the two spammables is nice because you can really manage your resources and trade back and forth if you start to run out of one or the other. So with the Vateshran duel, the damage does scale up pretty rapidly, so Ideally, we'll swap from whip to that about 75 to 80% health or so. You don't have to be exact, but whatever you can sustain is fine. However, we do still get Seething Fury stacks, which empower our whips, and those empowered whips do hit harder than Shrouded for quite a while. My specific setup only got to 2 stacked whips since I wasn't running Engulfing, but if you are running the triple stacked ones, those are going to be worth casting for even longer. But essentially what you'll ideally do is spam your Shrouded until your whip timer is about to run out, and then consume that stacked whip so that the timer doesn't just run out and you waste that extra whip damage. And you can stop doing this about 25% or so health remaining. The dual wield skill line actually gets another 20% damage increase from one of the passives. So by that point, Shrouded Daggers is hitting super hard. You'll see in my 125k parse, I was kind of just all over the place with it. It was actually one of my early parses trying the setup. I just happened to get lucky and land my best one. So I wasn't even really nailing the specific spots to change out abilities, but this, looking back, this is kind of how I would do it if I was doing it perfectly. And because we have all these long dots, really most of them are worth casting all the way until the end, as long as we're getting the full duration from them. The only one that kind of isn't is Engulfing, and I ended up not using that in my parse anyway, so I just kept everything going. But like I said, if you are in charge of that debuff, you definitely still want to cast it for your group. It just isn't 100% necessary if that is already provided by another teammate. So I know that's a lot of info packed into a small section. I hope it isn't too confusing, but play around with it. The rotation's actually pretty straightforward once you get into it. And all of the notes we have here are the same as the previous ones for the staff section. For the last static rotation section, I'll cover the stagger rotations. So these are for if you are responsible for keeping up Stone Giant's stagger debuff. The rotations are pretty much the same. Again, the only real difference is that the stagger debuff lasts 6 seconds. So with most normal weaving speeds, you want to make sure not to cast more than 4 abilities in between casts of Stone Giant if you want to keep it at its maximum of 3 stacks all the way through. Essentially, the only thing that changed here is we're moving one of our spam casts in front of Engulfing Flames to help spread it out a little better. Other than that, the rotations are still exactly the same as before and line up really well with the 15-second versions. If you want to do it with the staff back bar, it's probably better to do dynamic with unstable wall, but you can definitely still do the 15-second staff rotations as well and use the same principles that are used here on the staff rotations. Most of the notes are the same, but I thought I'd point out, as I did earlier in the skill section, that you can also run Stone Giant alongside of Whip and treat Stone Giant more as a buff to keep up and Whip as your main spammable. Clive did a really good job with this in his parse we talked about earlier as well. It is a bit more to wrap your head around, but essentially if you wanted to do a static like that, you can just mix in Whip casts inside of the 7 casts of Stone Giant section there. But ultimately up to you. I thought it's pretty easy to keep up with having it as your main spammable, but the ceiling is a bit higher using it alongside of Whip. And then finally, if you do want to go full dynamic, I have some notes we will go through and then we'll be through with the rotation section. So we keep all of the same openings if you're doing a dynamic rotation, but after the opening is done, instead of going into our repeating section, you'll start keeping up all of your abilities individually based on their specific timers. So this will be a giant priority order here. Obviously you won't have room for all of these skills, so you can just pick out the ones that you're using. So the idea is that if multiple abilities are ending at the same time, you can prioritize which to cast first. Abilities with strong upfront hits such as Carve, Unstable Wall, Talons, Eruption, and Rune are all nice to recast early if you want to make it so that you don't have multiple dots running off at once. This is something that just kind of comes with practice and really looking ahead with your timers and being able to process when things are going to run out. The order won't always be perfect because different factors can change things slightly, but should give you at least a decent idea. Stone Giant and Whip do jump up to the top of the priority if their timers are going to run out. You probably shouldn't run into this with Whip very often since it has a 10-second timer now, but the 6-second timer on Stone Giant Stagger is a little easier to let fall off on accident. Carve is listed first, not because it's the strongest ability, but because you lose your triple stack timer on it if you don't recast it a second or two before it falls off. Most of the other dots are roughly listed by their strength, though side buffs involved with casting them can cause the order to vary a bit too. For example, Wall, Stampede, and Trap are all great dots, but the priorities are also super high because they have strong buffs associated with them. Your Wall and Stampede are keeping up your weapon damage enchantment, and your Trap is giving you your minor force buff. Then the Ardent Flame abilities, Flames of Oblivion, Venomous Claw, and Engulfing Flames are good dots too, but the Seething Fury stacks they give make them a little higher priority as well. And then for our ultimate, you generally want to have all of your dots rolling when you cast it, but if you need to cast earlier to get the full duration, you can jump that up in the priority list as well. So like I mentioned earlier, the order can be a bit contextual, so don't get too hung up on that aspect of it. For example, if survival is the #1 goal, then maybe Deadly Cloak jumps up higher in the priority because it gives major evasion, especially if you're also using it with the Black Rose dual wield set. The order here can also change near the end of the fight when you may only get a few seconds from a dot if you recast it earlier, so it's better to just keep spamming your spammable throughout the end of the fight. You also want to prioritize your Zen dots if you are in charge of running that set. And really, don't get too hung up on the order being perfect. It really isn't a huge deal if things are done out of order, and you hopefully won't have too many situations where multiple dots are running off at the same time anyways. I know full dynamic can be daunting for those that haven't done it yet, but really just like anything else in the game, it just takes practice to start repping your head around, and you'll start getting a feel for skill lengths and when they're going to fall off and better ways to work the rotation around it. If you aren't quite ready, having static rotations with a couple of dynamic skills mixed in is a great way to get started on getting the concept down. For example, in some of the rotations, we have a full 15-second static, but then we're keeping up Deadly Cloak and Carve dynamically. So doing something like that is a great way to get started on getting the concept down. All right, now I just want to quickly talk about the test results. I won't go through these individually, but I do have this on my website. And if you want to go to the Google spreadsheet, you can click on each one and get the full combat metrics report if you want to dig a little deeper through the results for each setup. But I do have the sets that are used, the resource I was stacking, which rotation I was using, the food or drink, the potions we used. So if it's heroism, then that means we were getting brutality and sorcery elsewhere. So it doesn't really matter what you are running for your weapon and spell damage glyphs on those. Though like I mentioned earlier, if you are solo, you might want to do weapon damage because you'll be able to give yourself minor brutality there as well. On the dummy or with a Templar in the group, this doesn't really matter though. And then if it says spell power potions, I had spell damage glyphs, and weapon power potions, I had weapon damage glyphs. And then I have which race was used for each test, and also any special notes about the skill configurations or other notes like if I used double charged. But that info is all in the CMX reports that you can click on and look at for each one as well. Also a quick note on the Bahsei parse. I did drop my Battle Roar passive for that one to not get too much Magicka back for each time I cast my ult. This is something you might need to tweak if you are running Bahsei. I've seen people run with just 1 point into the passive instead of 2. I've seen people run with 0 points. I've seen people keep both points. So really whatever level you need it to be at to still sustain but not go against the Bahsei bonus too much will be ideal there. Ultimately, I found that whether you stack into stamina or Magicka, you have a little bit of leeway with your potion and food selections to use the opposite resource a bit heavier, though never quite as heavy as if you fully stacked into that resource. So tweak your food choices, tweak your skills. There are plenty of good ones to get it set up right for you where you can comfortably sustain it and still get really great results. All right, that's it for my DK guide. I had a ton of fun putting this one together. I hope this gives you some ideas for setting up the best way to play your Dragonknight. I want to give a big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. There are ways to help support the channel and keep these guides coming for as little as $3. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougar is Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, BlakeWin816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, and my wonderful wife. I'll close this one out with a few parses on the trial dummy. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.
$2.80 and complete your payment transaction. To repeat this information,